That's okay. Hello, we will be starting shortly, very shortly. Thanks for joining us. Okay. Fatma Mugagocek raised hand. How can you raise your hand already? We have there can't be any questions yet, Muge. All I've done is say we're going to start in a minute, so I don't allow any questions at this point. Thank you. All in due course. Well, good evening. My name is Mark Mamagonian. I'm the Director of Academic Affairs of the National Association for Armenian Studies and Research, NASAR, and on behalf of NASAR and the co-sponsor of tonight's program, the Society for Armenian Studies, thank you for making time in your day for us. And this is as good a time as any to remind you that both NASAR and the Society for Armenian Studies are member-supported organizations, each of which in its own ways and in complementary ways is focused on advancing and strengthening Armenian studies and research, and each of which therefore depends on you for support. So thank you for your support as members and donors, whether past, present, or future. Please consider it. We're grateful. I'm grateful to have with us tonight our friend and colleague, Professor Armen Marsubian, who is a member of the Society for Armenian Studies Executive Council, and I would like to invite Professor Marsubian to say a few words. Armen.
Thank you, Mark. I am so pleased to be here on behalf of the Society for Armenian Studies. Christine Moranchi, our president, does send her greetings. She had another job interview this evening and couldn't attend. And I'm doubly pleased because of the speaker who we have supported, and I'm glad to see we have supported in the past. And again, like Mark mentioned, we're a member-supported society, so I urge those who are working or have interests in Armenian studies to please join the society. And joining the society, you will also get free subscription to the Journal of the Society for Armenian Studies. As I said, I was very pleased to be involved this evening because of the overlapping interests I have with Hazal Ozdemir. I first encountered her, she reminded me, in a lecture I gave in 2017, I believe, in Istanbul, when she was an undergraduate there at the Bogazici University in the history department. I was speaking about photography, and then I received an email from her explaining that she had read my books, listened to my podcasts, that felt like someone was actually paying attention to the work I was doing. And over the course of the next year and a half or two, we exchanged correspondence and also exchanged photographs, because she's going to speak about that today in the Ottoman archives. She found many Armenian photographs, and she'll tell you about it. Some of them were Dildilian photographs that were used for the process that she's going to be speaking about in this attempt to control Armenians from coming back into the Ottoman Empire after they left, which reminds me of one fact in my family's life. One of the photographers in my family, my great uncle, Aram Dildilian, had to secretly leave the Ottoman Empire So his photo wasn't taken in the early 1900s. And he decided to return. And it was even more dangerous in returning because he hadn't officially left. So you'll hear a lot more about this from Hazal. So I'm so pleased to welcome you on behalf of the Society. And I turn this back over to Mark.
Thanks, Armen. Yeah, so the subject of Armenian mobility between the Ottoman Empire and the U.S. in the era that Hazal will be talking about, the late 1890s and early 1900s, and the methods used by the Ottoman state to try to control them is definitely still an understudied one, although until recently it was an unstudied one, I guess you would say. But in recent years, it's begun to be studied seriously, and I'm thinking of, in part, of the work of David Gutman in his book, The Politics of Armenian Immigration to America, 1885-1915, of Zeynep Gürsel's project, Portraits of Unbelonging, and now Hazal's doctoral research, about which we will hear tonight in this webinar, which is entitled, They Vowed Never to Return, Armenian Transatlantic Mobility and Undesirable Subjects at the End of the Ottoman Empire. Hazal Ozdemir is a PhD candidate in history at Northwestern University. And before coming to Northwestern, she graduated, as you heard, from Boğaziçi University's Department of History in 2017 and received her master's degree in the History of Art and Photography program at Birkbeck, University of London. Her dissertation project is funded by institutions such as the American Research Institute in Turkey and the Society for Armenian Studies, as you also heard, and also recently by Nasser and the Knights of Vartan Fund for Armenian Studies, which has provided a grant for her research for her dissertation as well. And Hazal is a Gulbenkian Fellow for the academic year of 2022 and 2023. So let us hear from Hazal, and Armen and I will disappear until after. Please use the Zoom Q&A to post your questions, which we will get to after Hazal's presentation. Right, it's all yours, Hazal.
Thank you, Mark. Hello, everyone. Many thanks for being here. And I also want to thank Nasser and SAS for this wonderful opportunity. I'm so happy to be here and share my dissertation research with you. And it's a delight for me to be introduced by Armen Marsobian, who also said that we met when I was a undergraduate student at Boğaziçi University, and he supported me a lot when I was applying to PhD. So it's really delightful to see him again here. Okay, I will share my screen right now. But why can't I do it?
Because it's Zoom, Hazal, that's why.
Oh, yeah. When we tried this morning, it was
Yeah,
working.
of course, it always works.
Exactly.
I don't see you yet. I see you, but I don't see your screen.
Yeah, when I do share, okay, I think it's working now, right?
Yes, it is.
Perfect. Okay.
Great. Good.
Sorry for that. I'm back. My talk today is titled, They Vowed Never to Return, Armenian Transatlantic Mobility and Undesirable Subjects at the End of the Ottoman Empire. We will delve deeper into the concepts of mobility, return, and being undesirable in a minute. In 2015, I went to an exhibition called Mobilizing Memory, Women Witnessing at Depot in Istanbul. The exhibition brought an international group of women scholars, artists, and activists to discuss the role of art in resisting the erasure of the past violence from current memory. Silvina Darmagardician, an Armenian Argentine, exhibited an artwork that she called The Texture of Identity, a tapestry on which she embedded studio and family portraits and wedding photographs of Ottoman Armenians, referring to their weaving and photographic practices, as well as the last unities of families before the genocide. By inviting the audience to touch the tapestry, the artist created a multi-layered haptic experience. These objects were touched by the dead, by survivors, by their photographers, by the artist herself, and by people who came to this exhibition as me. The questions of violence, memory, displacement, and the role of the photographic archive played in resisting erasure had already been impressed upon me before I began working on the Ottoman photographic registries of Armenian families who migrated to the United States between 1896 to 1908. My dissertation at Northwestern University explores how the government of Sultan Abdulhamid II engineered a photographic repository or an immigrant database to prevent Armenian migrants from claiming their subjecthood and belonging to their home. I contend that the Hamidian government first eliminated its Armenian population with a series of anti-Armenian massacres between 1894-96. Then, with the denaturalization requirement, Terki Tabiyet, the government turned what began as a temporary sojourn for males in the late 1880s, many of whom were motivated to return after they accumulated money to take care of their families, into a permanent form. Armenians who were bound to the United States had to renounce their Ottoman subjecthood, vow never to return, and deliver their 2 photographs to the state. Creating a bureaucratic apparatus for monitoring and policing the transatlantic mobility of Armenians who had become undesirable subjects was a crucial phase of state-sanctioned violence. Although the studies on violence in Ottoman Armenian historiography have been mainly limited to massacres and genocide, I opened the question of violence to investigate how the government utilized photography to set boundaries for Ottoman nationality in a crucial stage of emptying the Ottoman landscape from Armenians. My project and this talk will expand the category of anti-Armenian violence in the Hamidian era to contain the denaturalization of targeted populations and methods devised to control their movements, such as photoregisters. With the assistance of the American Research Institute in Turkey, the Gulbenkian Foundation, the Society of Armenian Studies, and most recently Nasser, I collected family photographs, studio portraits, official correspondences, Armenian newspapers, and naturalization petitions from archives in Istanbul, Paris, Boston, and Washington, D.C. My methodology is to examine the exit processes of Armenian women and children by tracking their photographs and denaturalization documents. I ask how the production, distribution, and archiving of photographs and denaturalization documents contributed to engineering what I call an immigrant database to keep Armenians from reclaiming their subjecthood and return to the empire. Hence, what I tell is not a story of immigration and settlement in the US, but the legal processes of exiting the empire and how did the Hamidian government shape this mobility, Ottoman membership, and the visual documenting strategies at the end of the empire. As work of the historians on Greater Syrian migration has shown, the Hamidian administration encouraged Syrian and Lebanese migrants to keep their Ottoman nationality and return to the empire. Armenian denaturalization was a pivotal step in the transition from the empire to the nation state, because this ethno-religious discrimination profoundly shaped Ottoman nationality and the formation of Turkish citizenship. Here, I will open a parenthesis about my word selection. I see the flow of Armenians as mobility because it's intended to be circular. Armenians wanted to go and then return. So I rather not to use the term emigration or immigration, which implies a one-way movement. Okay, closing the parentheses. Today, I will start with contextualizing Armenian mobility and explaining how did the Hamidian government begin managing Armenian transatlantic migration in the 1890s, and why I see it as a form of violence. I will continue with the denaturalization and making of the Ottoman subjecthood. In the second part of my talk, I will discuss some photographs and contextualize them within the practice of state photography in the early 20th century. Ottoman Armenians did not become suddenly mobile in the late 19th century. Instability in the Ottoman East and South Caucasia led to the mass migration of Armenians to the coastal cities of the empire since the 17th century. However, the speed and distance of mobility and the number of people on the move expanded drastically in the late 1880s. Armenian transatlantic mobility coincided with the age of high imperialism, which involved technological innovations such as steamships and trains, faster and efficient connections between places, and the emergence of new regulations and surveillance systems, such as quarantines, checkpoints, and passports. The labor opportunities in the post-abolition United States inspired Armenians to join Maronite Christians from Ottoman Syria and Lebanon, Sephardic Jews from Ottoman Palestine and the Balkans, and Muslims from Anatolia in waves of their migration. Like their Italian, Greek, and Eastern European counterparts, Armenians participated in the globalizing world economy as factory workers, weavers, and merchants. Armenians' transatlantic mobility was linked to their regional migration. The flow of Armenians between the Armenian plateau and coastal cities of the empire in the late 19th century indicates that Armenians were striving to find solutions to the socioeconomic problems in their region, even before the transatlantic mobility has begun. The increased involvement of the Ottoman Empire in the world economy resulted in the devastation of home industries. Thus, Armenians were burdened with double taxation, both to the central state and their Kurdish landlords, due to the inability of the Ottoman state to reform the tax system. The Ottoman state also deliberately settled Muslim refugees who fled the Russian Empire from the Caucasus after the Crimean War on Armenian lands. Unjust taxation, ethno-religious dispute, and targeted land confiscation propelled an Armenian exodus. Although the government passed a legal ban on Armenian labor migration in 1888, many people migrated clandestinely, as David Guttman's brilliant work demonstrates. While I was doing research at the Nasser and Nubar Library in Paris, I had a chance to read Armenian newspapers published in the United States in the late 19th century. For example, in October 1893, M.V. Beylikçi submitted an article titled "Stay in America or Return" to Hike, an Armenian periodical published in New York. This piece discussed whether Armenian migrants would remain in the United States and become Americans or choose to return to their homeland. Beylikçi argued that since the US government did not prepare employment opportunities and proper living conditions for immigrants, it had become challenging for Armenians to build a life there. The racism and harassment Armenians experienced in their interaction with Armenian workers who thought migrants were replacing them in the workplace increased their misery. In an anonymous response to Beylikçi's article, Armenians were encouraged to stay in the US for a few years and then return to their homeland, which was facing the danger of being repopulated by different populations and losing its Armenianness. While Armenian Americans were discussing to stay or return, the periodical Hike also shed light on the problems Armenian returnees faced in the early 1890s. For example, an Armenian who returned for a short while to take his fiancée back with him, an Ottoman official who saw his American passport spitted on his documents and imprisoned him. Another Armenian who tried to enter the empire from Salonika in 1893 to see his mother was quarantined before the police took his identity card from him. Although the American ambassador wanted to have a meeting with him, Ottoman authorities refused this demand and imprisoned the returnee for 8 days. Although he wrote a petition to the government explaining that he came home to see his mom, the police sent the migrant to Serbia. So what was the Ottoman Empire against Armenian mobility? Firstly, the more generic answer would be states don't like mobility. It's hard to track and tax mobile people. Since the 16th century, the Ottoman Empire tried to restrict the flow of beggars, nomads, bachelors, sex workers, peasants, and unemployed people from villages to the big cities of the empire. The government issued travel documents to maintain social and political stability, asayish, in the capital. The Habsburg and Russian empires also tried to manage the flow of their population, but it could not just be that, right? Because actually states love some kind of mobility or tolerate some kind of them while they disdain others. 19th century mobilities to, from, and within the Ottoman domains were diverse. Forced mobility or immobility, refugee influx, slave trade, pilgrimage, illicit traveling, organized tourism, and unwanted labor migration. It had become a central state project to define and maintain the boundaries between the diverse categories of mobility and make laws to govern it. Just as the Russian Empire managed the mobility of Jews and Crimean Tatars, and the Habsburg Empire dealt with its Roma population, the Hamidian government discriminated against certain forms of mobility according to the subjects of this flow. As I mentioned before, The restrictions on the flow of Syrian and Lebanese migrants were relatively light. The local officials of Mount Lebanon also complained that the Lebanese were migrating clandestinely by smuggling into foreign steamships, ecnebi vapurları. The Ottoman authorities decided in 1894 that the locals of Lebanon could be issued a travel permit if they wanted to go abroad, in opposition to the ban on Armenians. Although the local officials in Lebanon were not generous enough to ensure travel documents to every applicant, a Lebanese with a guarantor to attest his good standing was able to acquire a passport. Thus, the former Grand Vizier Said Pasha informed the Ottoman ambassador in Washington, Alexander Mavroeni Bey, that the restrictions placed on Armenians were not binding for Syrians and the Lebanese who could return to the empire. The pretext of the ban on Armenian return was the emergence of Armenian revolutionary organizations and their connections in the US. Although probably a handful of Armenian revolutionaries had migrated to the US, the Ottoman government was already alarmed about the presence of a growing Armenian community on the East Coast and began to police the migrants. Ottoman officials linked the cautionary bureaucratic measures on Armenian return with the belief that Armenians would bring their seditious ideas, such as autonomy, if they returned. To support this idea, the Ottoman government appealed to sources from their ambassadors. According to Mavroeni Bey's reports, some Armenians were migrating with the sole purpose of combat training and learning how to use dynamite and torpedo to attempt assassinations. Peak of the migration in the mid-1890s coincided with state-sanctioned anti-Armenian massacres, where local Kurds and Circassians killed hundreds of thousands of Armenians. Women and girls were abducted, and masses of Armenians began to convert to Islam to survive. Following the massacres of 1894-96, 28 Armenian revolutionaries stormed the Ottoman Bank in Istanbul in August 1896. Even though the attack was taken under control very quickly, Muslim crowds killed nearly 6,000 Armenians in the capital. The main target of this massacre was the Armenian laborers who came from the Ottoman East to work in Istanbul, especially the porters who formed the poorest strata. After this massacre, the police sent Armenian laborers immediately to their homes. Hence, migrating to Istanbul to work for the Armenian community was no longer an option. And the Ottoman officials highlighted that this prohibition was for both women and men. Living under the constant threat of another massacre, Armenians increasingly immigrated to the United States. 2 months after the seizure of the Ottoman Bank in October 1896, the Hamidian government began to encourage Armenian exodus by denying their right of return. The government justified the massacres to the European powers by demonstrating the seizure of the Ottoman Bank as an excuse. So we know that revolutionary committees that aimed for autonomy had developed among almost all the Christian communities of the Ottoman Empire. Armenian revolutionaries emerged under oppression and maladministration as their Greek, Serbian, and Macedonian counterparts did, and they modeled their activism on Macedonian revolutionaries who followed similar tactics to get the attention of the European powers. Although Armenian organizations' activities were limited in numbers and scope, and unlike Macedonian revolutionaries, they were not able to mobilize large numbers of people, the Armenian community was punished more violently. Coming back to transatlantic migration, the government did not only ban the mobility of revolutionaries, but targeted the Armenian community as a whole. Target tabiat was a prerequisite for any and every Armenian who wanted to leave the empire. When officials in Bitlis wrote to the Ministry of Interior Affairs to see if this applied to each sect of Armenians, Gregorian, Protestant, or Catholic, the Ministry of Internal Affairs said yes, for everyone. So we know that the Hamidian government legitimized physical violence as a strategic necessity to protect the integrity of the empire from works of Ronsuni and Tatmamuge Göcek. Regarding massacres as necessary and fair reactions, the government justified imposing violence on the totality of a population rather than just punishing the rebels. Denaturalization and denial of return was another policy of the Hamidian era, devised to punish Armenians as a wholesale community, not through murder, but bureaucratic means. Creating a bureaucratic apparatus to Armenians from reclaiming their subjecthood and return was a crucial phase of state-sanctioned violence, as I mentioned. To designate this stage, which followed physical violence, I employ the term bureaucratic violence. Bureaucratic violence is administered through decision-making, paperwork, knowledge production, discrimination, negligence, exclusion. Here, this concept refers to how the Hamidian government gathered and produced knowledge to target one ethno-religious community and normalize their discrimination. My project centers on new actors, including Armenian photographers or police, who capture the identities of Armenians, officials who deregistered Armenians from the population registers, canceled their Ottoman identity cards, police officers who received the photographs, wrote a note about the migrants at the back of the visuals and distributed them. This complex bureaucratic network required ordinary officials who worked in synchronization and collaboration. So let's talk about denaturalization a bit. The government was monitoring Armenians' denaturalization based on the 1896 Ottoman nationality law. This law prevented Ottoman subjects from changing their subjecthood status without the permission of the government. According to Article 5, if someone changed their subjecthood without the permission of the state, will still be considered an Ottoman subject. Article 6 argued that the government could deny return and subjecthood to the person who, without the authorization from the imperial government, changes his nationality or enters the military service of foreign government. By 1896, this law was extended to Armenians who were bound for the United States. I underline two exceptions in Armenian denaturalization, which makes the whole ethno-religious community a target and turned this into a form of violence. Firstly, the most significant outcome was statelessness. In the cases of Jews or other Christians migrating to Europe, people who wanted to renounce their Ottoman subjecthood were already granted citizenship in another country, and this was the reason why they were denaturalized. However, Armenians who were denaturalized remained stateless, as they had to wait 5 years to acquire American citizenship. Secondly, denaturalization of Armenians was systematically tracked and recorded, and renouncing subjecthood was itself a condition of emigration for all Armenians. Although some scholars have argued that nationality in the Ottoman Empire was personal and practical, when the Hamidian government specifically targeted Armenians, nationality is no longer personal. The government saw Ottoman nationality as something that could be given to and taken from specific interreligious communities. The government singled out Armenian mobility as peculiar, suspicious, and dangerous. Ottoman state's differentiation between mobilities of diverse interreligious groups established a distinction between Ottoman subjects, those who were able to move freely with the permission of the state, and Armenians who were prohibited from returning and were blacklisted and became undesirable. Another parenthesis about terminology here. Scholars who work on Ottoman nationality have used subjecthood, nationality, and citizenship interchangeably to translate tabiat. Citizenship is different from subjecthood or nationality. As Will Henley clarifies, while citizenship is practiced by those membership is most secure, subjecthood concern individuals in limbo, namely children and wives of foreigners, orphans, immigrants, and emigrants. And I assert that citizenship is not a suitable concept for the late 19th century Ottoman Empire. It entails political rights and civic freedoms, whereas the Hamidian government's hostility and suspicion towards its Armenian subjects led the government to limit its basic liberties of traveling and returning home. The government did not even trust ordinary Armenians who declared that they would be in America for a short time for purposes such as trade, education, and marriage, and it aimed to shape the transatlantic Armenian migration completely. So Armenians were denaturalized. Who could become Ottoman subjects then? Muslim refugees from the Balkans and the Caucasia and the former Ottoman territories after World War I could become members of the Ottoman Empire and later the Turkish Republic. Lale Can's work on Hajj and nationality demonstrates that Central Asian pilgrims residing in the Ottoman Empire did not automatically become Ottomans and later Turks due to their religion. However, pilgrims were in an advantageous position because they were Muslims. So while the state was defining its non-Muslim subjects as outsiders and undesirable people, and making them targets of forced nationalist homogenization, assimilation, and ethnic cleansing, it allowed foreign Muslims to become Ottoman legal nationals easier. Therefore, studying the Armenian denaturalization helps us to understand what was Islamic about Ottoman subjecthood and later Turkish citizenship. By revealing how Armenians were singled out as an ethno-religious community in the eyes of the Hamidian regime through bureaucratic means, I argue that the Ottoman attitudes towards Armenian migration and return provide a lens to comprehend demographic engineering in the late 19th century Ottoman Empire. I regard demographic engineering as the state policies which aim to shift the ethno-religious balance and composition of the empire, transforming and managing its population in accordance with the preferences of the government. Demographic engineering involves forced assimilation, deportation, or putting economic and political pressures on certain communities that eventually force them to leave the country. Scholars who have worked on population policies in the Ottoman Empire have assumed that the state began to target specific ethno-religious communities in the Second Constitutional Era, which is between 1908 to 1980. They have taken January 1913 as a critical date when the Committee of Union and Progress defeated their opponents within the Ottoman officialdom and consolidated power in their hands. Demographic engineering studies have focused on the first nationals homogenization, assimilation, deportation, and genocide by the CUP. So the exclusion of Armenians through bureaucratic procedures created a base for structural violence at the end of the empire and nation state. Structural violence refers to the deliberate indifference of the state to meeting its specific community's needs, citizenship rights, and civic freedoms. While closely policing their mobility, displacing them, withholding their basic rights as subjects, and labeling them as treacherous, disloyal, and suspicious, the late Ottoman Empire and the Turkish Republic violated its non-Muslim population's lives and properties. Hence, gathering and producing knowledge about Armenians and making them legible enabled the Ottoman and later the Turkish government to develop bureaucratic techniques that could be used in the governance of other ethno-religious communities. The compulsory exchange between the Greek Orthodox population of Turkey against Muslims in Greece in 1923 is the most visible continuity with the Hamidian mobility policing and population policies. Okay, I think it's enough of the legal matters and nationality. Let's talk about photography. To understand how denaturalization went hand in hand with photography, I try to understand why did the government want to store data ambitiously and send it to every port in the Ottoman Empire? In practice, how good this photography requirement could work? Although there were some ambiguities regarding the number of copies and destination of the photographs, it is evident that police officers were actors who were involved in the dissemination of photographs and their duplicates within the empire. These were two photographs held in different folders under the departments of the Ottoman State Archives. The copies of Haruf's family photograph look the same, but the back pages are not identical. So the officer who recorded the information of the migrants might have written the same note on the back of all duplicated photographs and sent them to different ports and ministries. Understanding the role of circulation of these photographs and the history of migration is crucial, as they shed light on the process through which a new technology that fascinated people with its ability to capture their likeness for posterity was adopted by the Ottoman bureaucracy as a means of surveillance. So the government could have expelled Armenians without taking their photographs or sending them everywhere. But the Hamidian administration set about constructing a technological apparatus, a predecessor to today's surveillance technologies that we see most prominently at airports, such as eye scans or fingerprints. The government pursued this as an attempt to either scare Armenian migrants and dissuade them from returning, or to demonstrate that the modern state has tools and skills to monitor the mobility of each and every subject. Think about it, like every time we exit a country, they have their eye scans and fingerprints in an airport. It's scary to know that governments know a lot about us. However, we're talking about roughly 120 years ago, and it's a vast territory. Could the Ottoman government know about its individual subjects as much as our contemporary states know? Probably not, right? For this reason, uncovering this corpus of material in the Ottoman State Archives and photographic venture reveals a curious practice. It must have been quite difficult for state officials located in the Ottoman ports to check all the files containing Armenians' photographs to detect their identities in the absence of a centralized biometric registry. Because it was a very ambitious project. Like these photographs were duplicated into 12. and were sent to the ministries in the capital, and every port Armenians could exit, like Trabzon, Samsun, Beirut, Izmir. And there were no centralized biometric registry, and these were not identity photographs. So this meticulous effort of the state to document the identities of emigrating Armenians by creating a photographic database in an impoverished part of the empire might seem like a strange preoccupation. Now, one might suppose that these photographs were taken perfunctorily to use the developing technology of the day. And when these photos arrived in the ports, officers archived them and nobody looked at these papers again. Actually, it was otherwise. The Ministry of Interior Affairs required that photographs must arrive before migrants reach the ports to allow police officers to identify them easily. If the Armenian migrants reached the ports before their photographs, they were not allowed to deport before their photographs were delivered and stamped. This happened once in Trabzon. A group consisting of 12 women and children had to wait until their photographs arrived, and this process might take weeks. And this rule was observed even in cases where provincial administrators and consuls tried to intervene on behalf of the immigrants. So as we can understand from this example, these visuals were not used as passport photos. Like the immigrants did not carry their photographs but themselves. And there was no tradition of attaching photos to passports before World War I. And these are not identity photos as we understand them today. The backbone of this photographic database consists of family photographs and studio portraits produced by local photographers. Maybe the government wanted a mugshot, but the result was what the local photographers used to produce. Mugshots were still very new in the 1890s and were not a widespread practice in the Ottoman Empire. While exploring convict photographs of Black people in 19th century England, Tina Kemp holds that criminal photography was not produced within the institutional setting of the prison or the police station in the late 19th century. The convicted were brought to the photography studios to be shot by professionals. Hence, their photographs were not significantly different from studio portraits of middle-class clients. Convicts were posed in postures of respectability. Their photos included props such as columns and tables, and they were posed against studio backdrops. The logic in the Ottoman Empire was very close to that. Although Armenians' migration papers were not convict photographs, the logic of this repository was also to identify, discriminate, and criminalize undesirable subjects. Nevertheless, the state logic could not fully tame the photograph subject and the photographs themselves, and could knot them into standardized files. These are not serialized images, but the photographers who produced these images did it within the framework of their skills, crafts, and abilities. The government of Abdülhamid II benefited from the growing vernacular photography tradition in the Ottoman East at the turn of the 20th century. The local photography studios, which were generally family enterprises, created a habitus of photography, in Stefan Schiai's terms, which brought together the material, the capital, social relations, and collaborations. The Ottoman government often commissioned these photographer families, such as Enkababians, Sursuryans, and Dildilyans, who captured photographs for the state. David Lowe and Armen Marsobian linked the development of photography with Armenian transatlantic migration and claimed that family photography became a means of, quote, sustaining imaginary cohesion and suggesting hope for future reunion, end quote, and a very symbolic attempt of keeping the family united during the moments of departure. Family photographs were an object of memory for the Ottoman Armenians, who were living with the fear of displacement and falling apart. While Armenians were being dispossessed and displaced quickly, and the memory of the geography was being erased, this new technology had the power to register what had been lost. Photographs gave strength to the ones who were left in the Ottoman East, and the dissemination of photography was building special networks, bringing families and friends together. And it sometimes gets difficult to distinguish the migration photographs from regular studio photographs in terms of composition, forms, and poses. Relatedly, the lines between migration photography and the practices Marsobian and Lowe talk about become blurred. I examine how vernacular photographers use studio backdrops, columns, coffee tables, and books in their photographs. Armenian migrants were captured as regular middle and upper class clients, and there was nothing different in the composition of some photographs that will categorize them distinctively. As Armen mentioned, we exchange a lot of photographs, and I was trying to understand what made the migration photographs different from ordinary studio photographs. And in general, as I said, there was no difference in terms of composition or the form of the photograph. So as the governmental practices turned the photography studio into a site of surveillance, studio practices circumvented the gaze of the state. State surveillance was practiced in the studio. Nevertheless, the very form and composition of the migration photographs resist the homogeneity of the state gaze, which regards Armenians as a seditious ethno-religious community. For example, in the first instance, images of Terenig and Vartanush look like ordinary studio photographs, since the Enkababian brothers captured the identity of their sitters with studio props such as columns and books and backdrops. These two photographs were taken by Dildilians as regular studio photographs with props such as chairs and coffee tables. Only when we turn the back of the photographs, we see the Ottoman writings behind them, in addition to the famous stamp of this photographer family. Since we have the specialist in the house today for the family photographs of Dildilians, maybe Armen can talk a little bit about it at the end. While studying on this practice, I wonder if Armenian migrants had a chance to prepare to their photo shoots beforehand or self-fashion themselves. In terms of anthropologist Chris Pinney, people would like to come out better in a studio photograph by adopting certain gestures and poses and mobilizing costumes and props. They would not like to pose in their everyday clothes. But probably there was no desire of being represented here, which is generally associated with studio portraits. Capturing migration photographs came close to what Ariella Ozulay called the civil contract of photography. This contract appears to be between the partner participants of the photographic event, but it does not mean that sitters willingly consented to be photographed and agreed for their images to be circulated. In the Armenians' case, not consenting was impossible if they wanted to emigrate. Thus, I'm not sure if the migrants knew that the state would duplicate their photos and send them to various places. Vernacular photographers were not the only producer-partner participants in the act of photography. This photo shows Hatun, who embarked on a long and unpredictable journey with her two sons, Artin and Hosep, in June 1908. The mother and the kids were preparing to emigrate to Chicago from Adana when a police officer took their photograph. Hatun told the police that they had no family left in Adana after the death of her husband, Ohan. Her brothers Karabet and Sarkis emigrated to the United States 8 years ago and settled there. When the police officer wrote all this information on the back of Hatun's photograph, he also signed the visual as the officer of photography, Memuru Fotoğraf. He would duplicate these visuals and distribute it to the Ottoman ministries and ports of exit. And the officer also claimed that he took the photograph with his humble skills, marifeti acizi ile ahsedilmiştir. It was mentioned in official correspondences that photographs would be taken with the help of the officer of photography in the police centers. So this was a common practice in the late Ottoman Empire, since Abdülhamid II appointed an official of photography to almost every institution, naval offices, police centers, prisons, hospitals, and hospices. Cameras, photo cartoons, and tables were sent to the Ottoman Empire from various cities such as Paris, Marseille, and Berlin, and distributed to provinces such as Sivas, Kayseri, and Adana from the capital. And it seems that police photography was a practice that extended to manage transatlantic mobility. In addition to the signatures by officers of photography, stamps on the photographs provide another encounter with the police. 4 women from the Sursuri neighborhood in Mamuratul Aziz, who wore very similar clothes, gave the same pose in front of the same backdrop on the same day in June 1908. It writes on the purple stamp on their photographs, "This photograph was taken with the means by the police officer." This might indicate the intermediate role of the police in the event of photography, such as taking migrants to the studio, as well as showing that the police directly took the photograph. Since it seemed unlikely that the police would have a studio backdrop, It might have been like the police could have directed the Armenians to an amateur or traveling photographer who was in the city at the time and then stamped the photographs. Bedros's daughter Mariam was among the 4 women from the Sursuri neighborhood who were photographed on the same day. Apart from the 2 police seals, this photograph is a double touch. There are 2 different dates on the photograph, one on the front and one on the back, with slightly different handwriting. This might be the proof of the photographs that were circulated between and held by different officers. One date might indicate the production date of the photograph, whereas the other one might be archiving. Okay. I will start wrapping things up. I'm a historian and I love to contextualize things. So while I study these photographs, which I think very special and exceptional in many ways, I also try to understand how the Ottoman government approached this requirement as a state practice and how the visual documenting strategies have been shaped towards the end of the empire. If we zoom out a bit, the Russian imperial government had also denied subjecthood to Jews who were emigrating overseas in 1892, but photography was not required. The Hamidian government might have been aware of this Russian policy and extended it to their own internal enemy with the added necessity of a visual proof. Hence, migration photographs should be contextualized within the practice of state photography in the late Ottoman Empire. We know too that Syrian and Lebanese Christians and Jews who migrated abroad were not photographed. So who were the other people whom the Hamidian administration frequently photographed? Armenian or Macedonian revolutionaries, anarchists, and convicts. In short, folks whom the state labeled as Arbab Fasad, literally experts of sedition. So I want to see the bigger picture here. How did citizenship, statelessness, and photography become related in different situations at the end of the empire and during the transition to the nation state? As I said before, gathering and producing knowledge about Armenians and making them legible gave the government the tools to manage and govern other communities as well. Towards the end of World War I, Ottoman officials began demanding up to 4 photographs from people who were exiting and entering the Ottoman domains. Thus, photography entered passwords worldwide during World War I. The necessity for anyone who was crossing the Ottoman borders to travel with their photographs, which were generally mugshots right now, can be seen as another crucial phase of border building projects and the transition from the empire to the nation state, in which policing had become more systematic and centralized. We looked at the bigger picture. Let's zoom in to the micro level again. As I mentioned, I think there are many exceptional sides to this photographic registry. While exploring what kind of historical knowledge might these photographs reveal about discrimination and violent erasure in the late Ottoman Empire, I also try to understand how these photographs challenge the homogeneity associated with identity photographs. I ask what we see differently when we see photographs as objects to be produced, to be touched, held, written on, exchanged, archived. And how does it make our understanding of this Emenge database more nuanced as an archival practice? How can we think about the photographic event in a certain way, which would make us explore the social, historical, and personal relationships within and beyond the image, the social life of the photograph? These photos were not only historical papers that the Ottoman government used to blacklist Armenians, but also the documentation of the last unity of families prior to an unpredictable journey from the places they called home. The migration photographs and this photographing practice record histories and futurities at the same time. They might also transmit their sitters' hopes and fears toward the future and registered, quote, a transnational circuit of negotiations and conflicts, of transit, passage, and connections, end quote, between states, families, and communities. By taking photographs as material objects of memory, my project joins a larger movement, both scholarly and public, to recover, document, and protect Armenian history and identity. While images of the Armenian genocide that can assist in defining and constructing identity and memory for the diaspora are often absent, as Marie Advoronian argues. My project reconstructs a visual archive of displacement and discrimination that has public importance. Many thanks for listening to me today.
Hazal, thank you so much. Armin's hand is up, I see. Armin, would you like to speak?
I was just going to applaud.
Very good. You were called out in the talk, Armin. Would you like to address the question that Hazal raised regarding the Dildilian photograph that she showed?
Well, I did want to point out a certain kind of symmetry to the whole issue of these photos serving the purpose of denying Armenian identity in their homeland, is that at the end of the First World War, when the recovery of Armenian orphans and women was taking place, the same photographs were often used and sent back by family members to the various relief agencies to identify lost members of the family. So the same material object now plays a role of recovery as it did for providing a kind of a barrier to return. And in many cases, these same photographs, especially the studio photographs, which are unlike the police photographs, were already circulating in the Armenian diaspora. So there's an interesting recovery role for the same image. And we know with photographs, it's not a stable meaning. The photograph, depending on the context, takes on new meanings. And the great irony here is that the meaning is in a way reversed. So that's just a comment, but I will let the audience ask questions, please.
Thanks, Armin. Yeah, please use the Zoom Q&A to post questions. I see a couple of them here. So first question, Hazal, is thank you for this compelling project. I've heard but never verified the statement that the Hamidian government required the creation of last names in order for the government to track or document Armenians. Is this historically correct? And if so, is there any connection to this issue of mobility?
I think it's a really interesting question. I didn't hear something like that. And in the documents and photographs I came across, Armenians were documented with the name of their fathers in the usual way, like Agop, son of Ohannes. But we know that Armenians used surnames in the Ottoman Empire, and when they emigrated to the United States, they were recorded with their surnames. And there's a fascinating project by Mark Aslanyan, who has a record of people who emigrated to the United States, an immense record. So I don't know if the Ottoman state registered Armenians with surnames and created surnames for that, but I will definitely look if I can see anything. Many thanks for this comment.
Yeah, my impression, which someone will correct me on if I'm wrong, and maybe, is that the codification of or institutionalization of last names is slightly earlier, maybe in the 19th century, and not necessarily during the Hamidian period, but someone will tell me I'm wrong. So
maybe, yeah.
If I am, please do.
And I came across many tables, which I call isim cetveli in Turkish, name tables. So the local governors recorded the names, ages, professions, neighborhoods of migrants left a certain neighborhood in a certain period of time. Let's say people who emigrated from Sivas in the May of 1893, and they were like all registered as, but their names and names of their fathers. So like I didn't came across their names.
Next question, fascinating and very timely analysis on belonging. Do you have a sense of how any such photographs or identity papers, how many such photographs, identity papers there are as a whole? And do you think there could exist local copies in the provinces still at this point?
Thank you very much for your comment, Hojam. Like I obviously benefited a lot from your work and the feedback you provided me and the workshop on Armenian Studies in University of Michigan. So thanks for that. I have 100 photographs. Like I collected like 105, and I think that there might be like other photographs, because like when I talked with an archivist from the Ottoman State Archives, they told me that there is still like 6,000 photographs waiting to be digitized. So I'm sure like there is like more material coming up. So like I try to check regularly the Ottoman State Archives. And I think there's a like big probability that these photographs might exist in provinces, in the port cities, but I didn't come across something like that in the better terms. Like I didn't look at like provincial archives, but I think there's a high chance that.
Thank you. Another question is, can you expand on your use of the difference between subject versus citizen in your discussion?
Totally. I love to talk about it. I associate citizenship with rights of the citizenship and the responsibilities of government for that citizen. So like we talk about like rights, responsibilities, civic freedoms when we talk about citizenship, and more like prominent kind of belonging. But subjecthood was a more fluid term in my mind, and like it's like by its nature, like it implies being a subject to someone. So like subject didn't have rights, and the state did not have responsibilities for them, but they were protected. So like rather than being a member of a political unit and actively participating in a country, subjects were protected in return for their obedience to the government. So I think that like I don't term what's like happening in the Ottoman Empire as citizenship, because subjects did not have like basic rights of freedom, or they could not travel. They were not politically participating in a state entity, and subjecthood, like it seems that like a subjecthood was easily given to and taken from different political and different subjects. But I think like it's open to question if like we have citizenship in the early years of the Turkish Republic or still, because like I think there are like many similarities between the Ottoman love of nationality and Turkish citizenship right now. So I think like it's a really interesting avenue to talk more about. For example, Narnaik Mekçoğlu calls the non-Muslim citizens of Turkish Republic as like step citizens, because like they were not seen as prominent as the Turkish Muslim members of the Turkish Republic. We can call them step citizens or still subjects in a way.
Thank you. The next question I'm gonna interpret slightly, I think, regarding Armenians who were photographed in the cities or towns or villages where they lived, who were not immigrating. Were these photographs ever archived by the Ottoman government, or was it strictly for those who were who had left or were leaving?
It were like strictly for immigrants, I would say, but like sometimes people didn't leave. Like I came across a few examples in the Ottoman State archives in which women were photographed and took a travel document and then gave it to their sons to like let them travel. So I think that like some of photographed people did not travel and remain in the Ottoman Empire. So there's a chance of that too. But like the logic of this photographic repository was to record the identities of emigrating Armenians, as far as I know.
Yes, Huri Barbarian points out that it wasn't, in fact, until 1934 that there was a law that all citizens of Turkey must have a last name.
Exactly.
I don't know, though, again, when it became a widespread practice among the Armenian community, exactly.
I like, from what I heard, like it might be wrong, but like Armenians were like using surnames among themselves. Like I'm not sure, but officially, yeah, like there was no surname rule until 1934.
Mm-hmm. But
like people like who migrated were recorded with their surnames on this like American immigration records. But that might be a practicality. Let's say like I'm Vartanush, daughter of Bedros in the Ottoman Empire, and then like I emigrate to the US and they record me as Vartanush Bedrosi.
Right. Yeah, this is an intriguing question in a sense. Regarding why the Ottoman government archived in such detail this sort of information about Armenians when they proceeded to exile or kill the majority of the population and destroyed the places where they lived, and yet this material was retained in the archives. Is that in any way a paradox, or is that simply par for the course, Hazal?
I think it's a fascinating question, and I thought a lot about it too, and like why would they want to store this data? So, but I think it was a part of the like process because they wanted to have the record of Armenians who were leaving, and it was a part of blacklisting them. So, and like this material changed, like the perception of this material changed for like where you stand. Like while I read it as a record of discrimination, border building, and a form of violence, it was a practicality for the Ottoman government and maybe like perfectly normal for them to have this record as a state, because like states want to like archive things, and they were not looking this as a practice like, oh, like we're discriminating Armenians, we're like not letting them go, but in a way like Armenians were like acting against us, so like we had the right to take the photographs and archive them, and now we have a record of whom we will not allow in our borders.
And I think there's this sense, which is not a reflection of reality, and maybe couldn't be a reflection of reality, that when in the wake of the Armenian genocide, that all traces of Armenians were expunged from the archival record. We know, of course, this is not the case because of all the research that's being done drawing on this material. And when we think about it, it would be almost physically impossible to undertake such a thing anyway. Yes, Armin, I see your virtual hand.
Yes, thank you, Mark. I see there weren't more questions. So I have a particular question. Could you say what exceptions were made for the right of the taking away the right of return in this period? Because and I'm particularly also thinking of mixed marriages and where Armenians have married citizens of European countries or citizens of the United States and have American or European citizenship, or have there are Armenians who have parents that are German and Armenian and are able to return after studying in Germany. So there must have been some exceptions made. I'm sure they're also based on class and wealth.
Like I didn't come across exceptions, but carrying an American passport was also like something that the Ottoman government did not want, because with the like pretext of like protecting their subjects, like the European governments intervened in the Ottoman affairs for a long time, like because like we know that like Armenians, Jews, or Muslims like who have Russian, European or Russian, French, or any other like European citizenship gave like a has been a problem for the Ottoman state because like it was afraid of foreign intervention to its domestic affairs. And it was same for the American government too, because if someone who claims to be an American citizen comes back to the Ottoman Empire, the government could not tax them, could not punish them. They would be under the protection of another government. So like, as far as I understand, denying return was like in part due to like trying to limit the number of people who were like having like foreign citizenship. But I don't want to form an equation here. I don't think that the deny of Armenian return was solely because they have American citizenship. It was like not all returnees carried American citizenship. So I think there is like something different there, but the citizenship issues of Armenian migrants had been a headache for like both governments, both for the US and the Ottoman government in 1890s. There were like continuous correspondences between the American and the US governments. And only finally in 1893, the president of the US said that, okay, like I won't interfere in the situation of Armenians anymore. Like you can deport the returnees, exile them, whatever you want.
Thank you.
Hazal, could you let me pause that. Yes, the Mugagocek comments that the origins of giving papers to people who lived in the Ottoman Empire but were not Ottoman subjects goes back to the 18th century. Question is, do we know which? Sorry.
Yeah, no. Please
do we know which departments and levels of officials had access to these photos? Were they generally easily accessible, or did you have to be at a certain level to have access to them?
I think it doesn't require a high level, because like I won't assume that police officers who took these photos were like generally high level, or like ports, like officials in the ports. And like I don't think that this was like this photographic registry was like secret, like top material. So I would say that more like low and mid level officials worked, as far as like I understand together. So I think like it's also like interesting because like when we think about the bureaucrat elimination of Armenians, we think about like high level bureaucrats like Talat Pasha and so on. But I think like this project is also interesting in seeing the collaboration between like more lower level bureaucrats.
Yes, since in this case, they would be the ones doing the actual enforcing. So
Exactly. Yeah. And there was a question about Muslim Armenians.
yes, I'm sorry, I lost track of that. Is there any connection to this body of material that with Muslim Armenians or Hamshen Armenians?
I didn't come across anything about them, but and the other thing, describe access to the Ottoman archives. I think like I'm a Turkish citizen, so like I used my identity card, like Turkish identity number to log in, and I think like it's a different procedure for non-Turkish nationals. And like these photographs were held in the Interior Affairs Ministry and Foreign Affairs Ministry departments of the Ottoman archives. Like Ottoman archives are composed of like really different departments, and it's like I found the majority of the photographs from like Interior and Foreign Affairs ministries, but they're not registered together. So like you have to like dig in. Like I like entered the key terms: migration, Armenian, Turkey Tabiyet, subjected like multiple times to see if the documents contain photos.
And could you just briefly repeat again, because you mentioned it in your talk, that this type of photographs were taken not solely of Armenians, but also of, you mentioned several other groups, including Macedonians.
Yeah, exactly. So state photography was a wide practice in the late Ottoman Empire, and like we know that Abdülhamid II has a thing for photography. Like he wanted to document all the like modern reforms the empire, and photographing and documenting like undesirable people was like part of that project, I would say. So there were like different mobilizations of photography, like both Armenian revolutionaries used photography as a tool to for themselves too, but the state tried to get a hold of like identities of bandits, anarchists, revolutionaries, convicts in the empire. So I think that like the practice of capturing the identities of emigrating Armenians was also like part of a like bigger project of like visual documenting strategies happening in the late Ottoman Empire. Like the desire to have like visual proof of like who should be blacklisted, like who should be recorded and be archived. So I think like there's like a lot to think about when discussing like whom to photograph, because I said like Jews who were migrated were not photographed, or like Syrian and Lebanese were not photographed. So instead of thinking about like who were not photographed during the act of migration, we can think about who were photographed in different instances. And I think it's also helpful to understand like what kind of image like the Armenian migrants had in the mind of the Ottoman government. Because when we think about like bandits, anarchists, revolutionaries, there were like people seen as facade, seditious people, people who were like harmful for the Ottoman Empire. So in a way, if you take the Armenians' photos like that and archive them, you also like start to label them as facade. And like it happened like in documents too. Like I like I came across like many documents in the Ottoman State Archives, like labeling Armenian migrants as a facade. And İlkay Yılmaz also like has a fascinating study on that. And Armenian migrants who were bound for the United States were also like seen as seditious. So like the act of photography also confirms the seditiousness of the migrants.
Right. But other groups then, sorry if I'm asking the same question.
No, go on.
Again, other ethnic groups were not photographed as part of an expatriation process. They were photographed in other circumstances for surveillance or identification, but not specifically as part of an expatriation process.
Like other transatlantic migrants, such as like Syrian and Lebanese Christians and Sephardic Jews, were not photographed, and like Syrian and Lebanese were like allowed to return and keep their Ottoman subjects when they were in the US. So I think, like as I said, like states love some kind of mobilities or like tolerate some of them and don't like the others. So like the Syrian and Lebanese migration was a form of mobility that the Ottoman government could tolerate or learned to tolerate, but it couldn't tolerate the Armenian mobility.
Thank you. Thank you. Armin, any closing words of wisdom?
No, but I love the talk, and I hope to at some point see the dissertation and follow the promising career of this important future scholar, current scholar, or future scholarship.
Thank you so much.
Likewise, and
coming along. No worries.
Thank you, Hazal. Thanks for on behalf of Nasser and Society for Armenian Studies, and to the audience. And if you know others who missed tonight's program, it will be viewable on YouTube in perpetuity, or as long as YouTube exists. So please send them to it, and that they may benefit from it as well. Hazal, thank you so much. We look forward to your next presentation as your work continues, and have a good night. Have a good night, everyone.